and welcome to Spare Change News TV. My name is Sam Baltrusis. I'm the editor-in-chief of Spare Change News. Joining me today is Alex Ramirez.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me on.
Alex is our online editor. He's also one of our main reporters. So I'm glad to have you on the show today. So tell me, there's so much that's happened this past week. So we have a lot to talk about tonight on Spare Change News TV. So last week, we had the Southampton Street Shelter basically opened up a new wing, or what happened with that?
So it's originally planned to have 2 floors, and it was an old renovated transportation building. It was where they held their signs, stored them. And so they only managed to renovate the 2nd floor back in January. That was phase 1. Phase 2, which was the 1st floor and some other spaces, was delayed from its original spring deadline all the way to, early summer. But they finally opened that up, which means it now has a capacity of a little over 400 people. Right now, the 2nd floor that was originally opened back in January is being used for safe harbor, transitional program beds. And the 1st floor is being used for the more general population.
So just to reiterate, so it's the Southampton Street Shelter. It was the replacement shelter for after Long Island closed in October, right?
Yes, and they were never really calling it the replacement shelter, but now that it's all built, it has the capacity. It's starting to look more and more that way.
So, and to give you some more insight, the Southampton Street Shelter, I was at the launch show with Alex back in January. There was only 100 beds and this is really cold winter, and so it also was just built for men. Yes. So it was a men's only shelter, and it's continuing to be a men's only shelter, right?
Yes, it's continuing to be a men's only shelter, but they're going to make Woods Mullen all women. Okay. So they're still figuring out the logistics of that.
So we actually broke that story back in January that they were going to turn Woods Mullen into a female-only shelter. Southampton Street is now, as Alex just mentioned, they have the 2nd floor is going to be more geared towards like rehab types scenarios. So rehab beds, which is a huge issue in our community. There's also the trans community. So are they also opening up Southampton Street to the trans community as well, or?
Well, if it's anything like Long Island, which I believe was a little more welcoming towards the trans community than some other shelters, then they should be, yes. But they're starting to figure out how do we deal with more unique populations within the greater homeless population.
And speaking of the trans community, so the LGBT community comprises a large percentage of our homeless population in Boston and in Cambridge. So the trans community, putting a trans woman into a men's shelter is a little odd.
Yeah.
Like, did you talk to anyone regarding the trans community?
Not recently, not at the launch, but in the past I have asked, what kind of measures will the city be taking when it comes to sheltering trans individuals or housing trans individuals.
Well, so it sounds like from what I gather, from what I've learned, is that there's like specific rooms that are set aside for the trans community, so that they were not necessarily put into the male population at Southampton Street Shelter. However, just from my experience, I think it would be good to house the trans women in the women's shelter, because they're women, which is kind of reflective of the ignorance of the city. So anyway, so we have the Southampton Street Shelter. We also have the Mayor Walsh had a roundtable discussion last Wednesday.
Yes,
you were part of the discussion. Mayor Walsh, and this is our cover story coming up in Spare Change News. Mayor Walsh is saying that there is going to be the end of homelessness in Boston in 2018. Now, do we think that this is realistic, Alex?
It's a little early to say because so much of it is still up in the air. There's a lot of stuff that hasn't gotten nailed down. I think given the relatively small population size of Boston, maybe 3 years is possible if we get the act together and get all of these resources allocated immediately. But it's also worth pointing out that it's not that no one will ever end up on the street again, or that we're going to move everyone out and the shelters will be empty forever. They're using a functional zero. So it really means, how long does someone stay homeless, or as they probably want to start saying, how short does someone stay in a shelter last? So it's tricky, and there's plenty of reason to have doubts about it, but there's also some reasons to be optimistic about it. They have been meeting with representatives from Houston, for example, which has reduced their homeless population by over 50% in the last few years. They're adopting more of a housing first model,
Good.
which is something that's much needed. It's very outdated to just try to shelter alone. We need to focus on how do we get people from the shelter back into housing as soon as possible.
So what's the difference between housing first model to rapid rehousing? Is it pretty much the same idea?
It's a similar idea. In this state, the main difference would probably be that rapid rehousing is most commonly used in the context of family homelessness.
Okay.
So up until now, rapid rehousing has probably been more of a state and even private group sort of project.
So the housing first model, just to fill you in if you don't know what it is, it's basically giving people a place to live and then dealing with all the other issues after they have a
Yes.
place to stay. So for example, if one of the people, homeless person is alcoholic, they can deal with their issues with alcohol after they have a home.
Yes, to paraphrase what the Chief of Housing, Sheila Dillon, said at the roundtable, it's not just enough to put them in a house. We have to be able to support them afterwards. So the support network after we house the people, that's also part of Housing First.
Now, and there's also the decrease in veteran homelessness is actually pretty profound, right? The numbers went from a few hundred to under 100.
Yeah, there's a couple of layers to the numbers, but it's well under 100. It's, went from triple digits to double digits in just about a year.
That's amazing. However, and this came up when we actually did an online exclusive talking about the roundtable discussion, and there were a lot of critics that were asking, kind of pointing at the holes in Mayor Walsh's plan.
Yeah.
One of them, is like, what about children? There's like the percentage of children based on the census has increased dramatically. And there's
Yeah.
children, there's women, there's a lot of issues that you can't just say we're going to end in homelessness because it's sort of a chronic issue for many people, and it's sort of it's ever changing.
Yeah.
So we talked about numbers. We have the census numbers from when Mayor Walsh and the city workers actually went out and did a point a night census. What are the numbers?
The numbers they found, I believe, about 600 unsheltered people in the streets, which was an increase. They found about 1,500 overall in the shelter system,
Right.
which, Boston has been on a steady increase in homelessness for the last few years now. And there's a number of attributes for it. One reason might be just general people migrating into the city. But some of it, I do think, reflects our issues with our housing and homeless shelter system.
Yeah, I think that, I was actually at the International Network of Street Papers Summit in Seattle representing Spare Change News. We actually unveiled Spare Change News TV to many editors and staffers from all over the globe. They loved the show, and they think it's a great way to convey what, like a multimedia way of kind of putting the message out and giving a voice to those without a voice. So it was fantastic. But when I was in Seattle, I was blown away by the number of unsheltered on the streets of Seattle. And someone came up to me and they said, you know what, I heard that Boston didn't have any homeless people. And, what I told them was that our homeless population, because it's so cold in Boston and Cambridge, that a lot of our homeless population are actually sheltered or in temporary shelters. There's a lot of families that are put into hotels. So there's like different, it's very different than Seattle mainly because of the weather. So there's a very small unsheltered population, but a very large shelter population. And do you feel like what? So I saw some of the numbers. So according to their statistics, do you think, first of all, do you think that the census is realistic, or is it like actually truthful to like what really is going on out there?
I'm sure the numbers of unsheltered homeless are much bigger than the census finds, but how significantly different, I can't say. But I'm sure there's a few groups and clusters that, if they get wind that the census is coming through, they do their best to hide from the counters, or you just don't know how, we should probably get better at tracking the movements of the homeless within our city, so to speak, rather than just who do I see on the street at this point in time. It's kind of a misunderstanding of the culture to think that the homeless are just going to stay in one place.
Yeah. Well, you were out in the field with the mayor when he did that, and the truth is, we know this because I'm friends with a lot of people who are vendors and some unsheltered homeless people in Cambridge. They come to Cambridge when they do the point in time census, and they don't want to be counted for whatever reason. It's their business why they don't want to be counted, but it is not realistic to the numbers who are actually on the streets.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that there's I know that we want to necessarily talk negative about the mayor, but do you feel like that the numbers they're trying to make it seem like it's not as big of an issue as it actually is?
Oh, of course. Whenever you hear people say, our numbers aren't as big compared to another city, well, our city's not as big as a lot of the other cities out there too, They know it's a crisis. They've called it a crisis, so it's strange that they'll try to downplay the numbers at the same time. It's really a problem. We need to understand that even if it's just a couple of homeless people, that's still an issue we need to deal with. So I do think they're trying to downplay it a bit to soften the blow.
So what's next for the mayor of Boston, and do you feel like that they're actually going on the right path in regards to having a plan?
Yeah, I think adopting a housing first model is the right move. I like a lot of what they said in the abstract. For example, the first move they need to do, according to their own action plan, is to build a coordinated access system. So that's essentially a database that all the shelters and agencies in the city, public and private, will have access to and say, okay, we have someone in here who has problems who needs recovery programs. Rather than just sending them off to any shelter or the nearest agency, they'll put them in the right fit for them. And, we have a family, we need to get this family somewhere appropriate, or a youth. It's about matching the client with the appropriate service. And that's good, but it's not built yet.
Yeah.
And so the D&D, the Department of Neighborhood Development, needs to meet with a couple of other departments to really figure it out, really come up with a final budget. So we don't even know what the timeline is on that yet.
I want to say this as someone that's representing Spirit Change News and working with the homeless population. I will say this to the mayor of Boston: you've come a long way in regards to trying to make an effort to help the community. It was bad in the winter, and it's gotten much better. So we applaud you for taking the appropriate steps, specifically going for the housing first model, because I think that is the solution. But so, what are your thoughts? Do you if you would rank the mayor's performance in regards to homeless issues?
Oh, if I were to do it term by term, he's probably getting he did some good homework and finally finished a project late. So maybe he's got a B for, the spring, summer term. But overall, he's probably still C range at best. I couldn't see myself, closing the Long Island Bridge in 4 hours was certainly a failure.
Yeah.
And it was one that he, granted, was kind of set up. He was kind of dealt a bad hand when he got that bridge, but I think it's still a situation that could have been handled differently, and if not sooner, I think they could have found ways to delay it.
Yeah, and so the bridge. So we're talking October, November, December of last year. DF, when it comes to grades, because it was very bad. It was very traumatic for the people that were put into pretty inhumane conditions after the closing of the Long Island shelter. So there was really not a game plan. In fact, we've written about it so much, and we've talked about it a lot on Spirit Change News TV. It was a true crisis, and it was a tragedy. It was tragic what happened last October. Now, the mayor has an opportunity to kind of work on what's going to happen for next winter, because we're in the summer now. It seems it's beautiful outside, but what about the winter? And do we have a game plan to effectively house our homeless population?
I believe their game plan would be to house about 250 people, not by the winter, but by this point next year. I think before the winter, they need to get Woods Mullen, figure it out. If it's supposed to be, you know, a women's only shelter, let's make sure it's ready for these women before that winter happens, so we're not facing the same overcrowded conditions or confusing and just lack of communications. I think that's, you know, another big priority besides getting that database figured out.
So another big thing that happened in our community is there was the Boston Homeless Solidarity Committee. They had a cookout. Lenny Higginbottom, who is a homeless man, he's been homeless for 23 years. He had the idea of having a cookout by the homeless for the homeless. Tell me about your, like, I know you're only able to go there for a short bit of time, but it looked like it was a huge success.
Oh, it was gigantic. It was a line curling around the park fence. They were blasting music. People were enjoying themselves. And I managed to speak with Lenny for quite a bit. He's also a spokesperson for the Boston Homeless Solidarity Committee. And he came up with the idea of this program, of this barbecue, last year. And he funded it all with his own Social Security check.
That's amazing. I heard there was a wedding as well at the cookout. Did you hear about the wedding?
I did not hear about the wedding.
I think it happened later. I was trying to find pictures. We'll post them online. I have a link on our Facebook page and Spare Change News. But yeah, there was a man and woman who I think that worked with the Boston Homeless Solidarity Committee or somehow was connected to the cookout. Decided to get married at the cookout.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so that's pretty cool. And you know, kudos to Lenny for thinking, you know, like actually doing something and like taking the efforts to do this. It's amazing, and to use your own money to feed your brothers and sisters is a true testament of your good nature. And I hope hopefully this will continue to be a yearly thing.
Yeah. It was such a huge success. I think there'd be a lot of disappointed people if they didn't do it again next year.
And so tell me like the logistics. So it was in Roxbury.
Yes, it was at Roxbury. It was at Ramsey Park, which is right by Jim Rice Field. And they had a few local vendors, you know, local meat markets, donated some food or donated some money even. And you know, Hand Delivered Hope was there with some clothes and supplies, and it wasn't just food either. There was, you know, sun lotion, some toiletries, and they had a few big tents. It was under some trees, so there was shade, there was food. It was like, it sounded great just for that day in general, like a nice barbecued food and some shade. Who wouldn't want that?
Yeah.
For the homeless, you know.
I think it's a grassroots at its best, and so I definitely applaud Lenny and the Boston Homeless Solidarity Committee for hitting a home run. There was some concern regarding there was no press by the mainstream media for the cookout, so there, which is, you know, I'm not saying it's typical, but we, you know, we're covering it in Spare Change News, and like that's what makes Spare Change News special. We cover the stories that the mainstream media, like the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald, they don't cover. I will say this, like GBH does a really good job of covering homeless issues. So congrats to GBH for doing a great job. And then also, you know, like there's definitely online coverage that is really good. So, you know, what's all these three huge stories, and they kind of hit all in a few couple of days. So what's next for you? I know that you're taking a brief hiatus because it's, you know, Alex has been working nonstop with Spare Change, so we applaud you for all your hard work. You also are, you're a student, so you have to deal with your student issues.
I've got some responsibilities to deal with on that front.
So what are the next story? So we're basically following Walsh as to what he's doing next is going to be huge, and then the South Campus Street Shelter. What, you know, just to reiterate what we were talking about earlier. So the shelter was supposed to open up, you know, with more beds in April, and it's in the summer. It's in July. Well, it was in June when it opened last Thursday. What was the holdup?
Mainly it was that when they got to the first floor, and I think the basement, they found there was a lot more asbestos than they realized, and there were a lot more electrical issues than they were expecting. It's an old building, and in some ways it's almost expected, considering the state of a lot of those buildings down there. But that was the main holdup. They did start opening beds up in about increments of 150 once the original deadline passed. So it became 250 at the end of April, and then they had another 150. So in some ways, you could look at it as they just added the final 150 a week ago.
What I mean, the part that makes me the happiest, is the rehab beds on the second floor.
Yeah.
No, so they're not detox beds. They're actually people that have already detoxed.
Yes, it's one of the programs you have to graduate to.
Okay.
So, Andrew House is still not yet replaced. The three private programs that were on Long Island, those have supposedly found new homes or are working towards new homes. Volunteers for America, Bay Cove, and Victory programs. So two of them are apparently in the talks for some new land deals, and then one of them, I believe, just got out of a bad insurance deal, and now the city, and I think the state to an extent, is starting to help them find some places too.
So definitely it's a crisis when it comes specifically to opioid and heroin addiction. I've heard a couple of deaths recently related to heroin, and it's continuing to spike. Yeah. So this is an epidemic of a grand proportion. It's affecting our city. It's affecting our state. If you go outside of Boston, the numbers of people dying from heroin is huge.
Yeah.
So it's definitely an issue that we as concerned citizens need to address. It may not be happening in your backyard, but it's happening in the North Shore, South Shore, all over the state. Worcester, it's an epidemic in our state, and it's an epidemic all over the country. So I am grateful that the mayor is addressing that by having the second floor of the Southampton Street Shelter dedicated to detox beds, but we need more help. And so you talked about hand-delivered hope at the cookout. Were you able to interact with them at all, or?
I just spoke with them for a few seconds. I think they mostly just helped out with provisions, but I could be incorrect with that. It sounds like the bulk of the organizing was by the Boston Homeless Solidarity Committee, but yes,
Right.
Hand-Delivered Hope, they deal more specifically with the recovery issues from
Right.
Long Island. So they're almost the complement, if you will, to Boston Homeless Solidarity Committee. But they both overlap and interact and work together a lot.
And they're a great group. Like they formed right after the closing of Long Island.
Yes.
Hand-Delivered Hope.
And they would mostly just collect supplies and deliver them throughout the city, wherever they saw groups of people collected. So there were a lot of homeless people huddled in doorways to big buildings after Long Island closed.
Yeah.
And they were out there helping, providing food and clothes and any other things.
The one question that I had, did the numbers from the point in time census reflect Long Island?
They do make some mention of Long Island's closing, but I think what do you mean by reflect Long Island? Do they show an increase after
Yeah,
that?
because we know just like anecdotally that people that were on Long Island, some of them who were in a shelter refused to go to the South End, and they actually were in in Jamaica Plain, setting up a tent. Do you? I was just wondering if the numbers spiked at all, or if there was an increase in the numbers.
There was an increase, but I don't want to confuse the population. It was either the unsheltered or the actual sheltered that
Right.
increased. And like I said, the greater trend, either one could be true.
Right.
So I just don't want to put out the wrong information. I think it is might have been in the article, or might have been released, or the study might have been released just after that.
Right. So anything else?
Apologies for that.
So anything else, Alex? So there's a lot of stuff that, the thing is because it's summer, the cover stories have been a little bit lighter in nature. We had Taylor Swift on our cover last week, and we've had a lot of celebrity social justice type stories. But the next issue is going to be pretty hard hitting. So we're talking, the cover story, I'm going to give you a sneak peek of our cover. So we're still negotiating what the headline, but we have, this is a cover. So it's going to be about the mayor's new plan to end chronic homelessness by 2018. We also have a couple of great stories. So are we doing, so the Southampton Street Shelter, we did a pretty strong coverage on our Twitter feed regarding the reopening or the opening of the additional beds at the Southampton Street Shelter. We also he did amazing coverage of the cookout. So if you want more information regarding the stuff that we talked about today, go to our website, sparechangenews.net, but go to our Twitter feed. That's where the magic is happening. So it's twitter.com/sparechangenews.
Correct.
I came back from Seattle sort of energized with the having more multimedia, more online presence, and I think that we have a lot of great things in store with Spare Change News TV, possible collaborations with other street newspapers throughout the country, possibly throughout the world. So this is like a flagship show for many other street papers. So you're part of something that's becoming, hopefully, going to be a national network of other street papers trying to give a voice to those without a voice. So thank you for being on the show, and I'm going to miss you when you're gone for a couple of weeks, because Alex and I work very closely together, and he does a fantastic job with the website and also as a reporter. So anything else, Alex, before we go?
I'm sure you won't miss me as much as we missed you when you were out in Seattle trying to scramble and get everything together.
Yeah, it was. I definitely had some interesting phone calls while I was away. So thank you very much.
We are young.